Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for our breakfast and panel discussion on politics and free speech on campus, then and now. In particular, I want to extend a special welcome to those of you who are here with us during your reunion weekend. For those of you I don't know, my name is Lauren Noble, and I'm the founder and executive director of the William F. Buckley Jr. Program. Thank you. The Buckley program is devoted to bringing much-needed intellectual diversity to Yale's campus, and we accomplish this throughout the year by hosting lectures, firing line debates, conferences, seminars, and much more. You can learn more about our efforts by visiting our website at www.buckleyprogram.com. I'm going to kick things off this morning by asking a few questions of our panel, but we really do want to have plenty of time to hear your questions. So please, when we get to Q&A, just raise your hand and we'll come around with a mic. Our only rule for questions is that the question must have a question mark. And please also be aware that this event is being recorded. Now to briefly introduce our panelists. Jeffrey Cabaservice is the author of several books, including The Guardians, Kingman Brewster, His Circle, and the Rise of the Liberal Establishment, and Rule and Ruin, The Downfall of Moderation and the Destruction of the Republican Party from Eisenhower to the Tea Party. Currently the Director of Policy Studies at the Niskanen Center, Jeff has been a visiting assistant professor at Yale, a columnist for the New Republic, and research director for the Republican Main Street Partnership, among other posts. He holds a BA in political science from Yale, an MPhil in international relations from Cambridge University, and a PhD in history from Yale. Wallace DeWitt is from the Yale College class of 2003 and is a financial regulatory attorney in Washington, D.C. A graduate of Harvard Law School and the University of Cambridge, Wallace clerked for the U.S. Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia Circuit and also served as executive director of research of the Committee on Capital Markets Regulation. His writings have appeared in National Affairs and The Federalist, among other outlets. Nathaniel Zelinsky is a recent graduate, and by recent I mean Monday, of
You're here.
Of the Yale Law School. He majored in history as an undergraduate at Yale and also holds an MPhil from Cambridge, where he studied history in international relations. His writings have appeared in a variety of outlets, including Commentary, Foreign Affairs, The Washington Post, The Atlantic, and National Review Online. And he's also the editor of Campus Speech in Crisis, What the Yale Experience Can Teach America, which you can get a copy of today right outside of this room for free. And he is going to go on to clerk for Jeff Sutton on the Sixth Circuit, and then following that, he will clerk for Judge Steve Williams on the D.C. Court of Appeals. And finally, we have Weaver Lilly, who is a freshman from Washington, D.C., who hopes to study history, ethics, politics, and economics, or political science. He's one of the Buckley program's 300 student fellows and serves on our student board as social media director. This summer, Weaver is working in Connecticut politics. So please join me in welcoming our panelists. So my first question for you all is, how would you describe the state of free speech and overall intellectual climate on campus during your time as an undergraduate? And how, if at all, do you sense its condition has changed in the years since? Do you want to start?
Sure, I'll start. So I entered Yale. Incidentally, very daintily, she referred to me as a financial regulatory attorney. I currently work for one of the commissioners of the Securities and Exchange Commission. So here's my disclaimer. I'm here in my personal capacity. Anything I say does not reflect the views of the chairman, the commissioners, or the staff of the Securities and Exchange Commission. I can tell you that they almost certainly do not reflect the views of much of the staff of the So with that, I entered Yale in the fall of 1999. The big issues then were, of course, the Monica Lewinsky affair. Subsequently, 9/11 happened when I was a junior. The war in Iraq began when I was a senior. So that gives you a sense of what the big issues were on campus at the time. My impression at the time, most of us on the right at Yale thought Yale was kind of loopy, and we sort of still do. I would say that normally, as a securities lawyer, I don't tend to look at current trends and extrapolate them in a straight line, assuming that if the economy's down, it's going to be 10 times worse in 10 years. Normally, that doesn't work in human affairs. Yale may be the exception that proves the rule. What I've seen in the New York Times and everywhere else, what everybody else in the room has seen, my perception is that Yale was sort of a halcyon period in the late 90s and early 2000s, and it seems a lot worse now. And Weaver, I'm sure, can speak to that more than anybody. But I've often talked to a professor of mine at the time who thought that, in retrospect, between the kind of peak of the postmodern objection to Western Civ in the late 80s, the sort of Alan Bloom era, and the 2015 Halloween costumes affair, we probably were not quite as aggressively politically correct when I was there as it is now. But I'd love to hear from the younger alums particularly how it is.
Yeah, so I entered Yale last fall, and the era that we're in, most people refer to, the older students, juniors and seniors, refer to it as the post-riot age. So anyone with access to any major news source or the internet has probably seen YouTube videos and clips of what were referred to as the riots of, I think, 2015, which, I think I don't really need to do much explaining there. And this post-riot phase has, I think, most people still feel like they're walking on eggshells when dealing with issues like free speech and stuff, because the campus left doesn't want to return to, that era where they were, that stage where they were vilified and seen as, incredibly immature, and rightfully so, and attacked in the national media for, horrible behavior on campus. And I personally wasn't there, but from all I've heard, it was, pretty awful. And now, both sides are trying to carve a path here, and the campus left, like I said, doesn't want to return to that, and the right, people like us, conservatives, the Buckley program, wants to usher in a new era of, a lot more free speech, better dialogue, stuff like that. So it's very tenuous. I think we're getting there, though. It's better. People are conscious of what happened then, and definitely don't want to go back to that. I think Wallace made a good point that, we see these issues in constant decline. Right now might be a time, a turning point where things start to get better just because they were so bad 2 years ago or 3 years ago now. And it might take something so catastrophic like that, and catastrophic is a bit of a loaded term, but to turn things around. So, we have to wait and see.
Sure. So I guess I see things a little differently. I think there's a temptation to take what are admittedly very visible incidents and to extrapolate from those. I think that if you really look, there are a lot of things that are very positive that happen every day on Yale's campus. I was in the law school for 3 years, so that may be a little bit of a different perspective for me, and I graduated from the undergraduate college 5 years ago. But from my perspective, there are lots of everyday interactions that occur where there are vibrant debates and dialogue, and I don't think that there's things that are, I don't think the boundaries for what's out of bounds have really creeped too far out. There are, on the other hand, moments of deep concern, and I think the 2015 incident was an example of that. There are other structural things that concern people. In particular, Judge Cabranes and Professor Stith in that little booklet that's outside are very concerned about the way in which faculty governance has been eroded. And so I think there are some concerns that relate to questions about free expression, but I just wouldn't lose sight of the positive interactions that do occur, which you tend not to see because they're not going to make the nightly news. And so the university is still doing good things. And yeah, these free speech issues have a cyclical effect. If you look back in the 1970s, let's say the late 1960s, you see moments of protest, then you see it sort of die down. In the mid-70s, it picks up again in the 80s. There are moments where folks get very heated, and those are worrisome. But I think that positive things still happen, would be my message.
I need to preface my statements by mentioning that this is my 30th reunion. That's why I'm back here. I was part of the class of '88. One always tends to ascribe Machiavellian cunning and foresight to one's political opponents. I was back here last for the Buckley program about 2.5 years ago in the immediate aftermath of the Halloween riots. And many of you perhaps were also here for that occasion. And that was when Greg Lukianoff from FIRE made a joke about how what the Christakises had done, talking about Halloween costumes, you would think this was such an awful thing that they had burned down a native village. And this led to the assembly of a flash mob outside of the conference, and students chanting, "Genocide is not a joke." And what I'm imagining is the leadership of that flash mob saying, okay, this is kind of ridiculous, we admit. We're having this protest about a joke. Genocide is not a joke is frankly not a great hashtag. It's the best we could come up with on short notice. But what this is probably going to mean is that the Buckley program in the future will actually have their next program off campus at an ungodly early hour on alumni reunion weekend. Returning people will have, being conservatives, have valued the imperative of tradition and friendship by staying up till 5 in the morning drinking bourbon. Our present sacrifices seem like a lot, but think of their pain and suffering on that future occasion. It'll all be worth it. Well, here's to you kids. It worked. Anyway, I came in '84, and in hindsight, '84 is not that long after the conservative Yale era. George W. Bush's class was the class of '68. He entered in the fall of 1964. He's going to be having his 50th reunion. His class will be having their 50th reunion next weekend. And Yale in '64 was a very conservative place. By 1968, it was considerably less so, but the change had begun in that era. And '64 was only 20 years before 1984 when I entered. And history has echoes. You could still sort of hear the echoes of the more conservative Yale at that time. And I think this is what made a lot of conservatives at the time more angry than they might otherwise have been, because you could sort of see that the past was there, it was not that far away, and yet we were living in a very different kind of present. And Yale actually was a fairly heated place ideologically in the mid-'80s. It began with the Local 34 strike, which wrecked my freshman year when I got here, and it continued on with the anti-apartheid demonstrations and the construction of the Shanty Village on Beinecke Plaza, which actually, as I graduated, an alumnus from the class of '58 torched it and created a whole new set of controversies. And then came the culture wars when I was in grad school. So I think Yale has actually always been a place for the last 40 years of considerable ideological contention. One could always argue that it's going ever more to the left, and it is in certain ways, but it's not in other ways. I think Nathaniel's right. There's ways in which you can actually argue that Yale has become more conservative in recent years, and perhaps we'll get into that in our discussion.
So we sometimes forget that Yale does have a very strong statement on free speech, the Woodward Report. And so my question for the panel is, to what extent do you think the university is living up to the principles the Woodward Report articulates? And do you have any specific stories or examples that you want to point to in discussing that?
Yeah, I don't know if I'm going to directly answer your question. But one of the things that I think is very interesting when you read the Woodward Report, and I recently reread it again, or the bits we had excerpted in that volume, is that Woodward, or more accurately, Robert Dahl, who wrote the first section, likely, were very concerned not just with what I would call the absolute right to free expression, but also with the responsibility to act maturely. And one of the things that I think we can forget in conversations around free expression on college campuses is also the purpose of free expression on a college campus. It's to allow for a give and take of a marketplace of ideas, a real vibrancy in an intellectual community. For that to work, though, there has to be a kind of generosity and tolerance on either side. There has to be a real ability to give and take and understand other people's ideas in the most charitable light. One of the flip sides of that, and the report actually discusses that, is an obligation not to provoke tension, not to cause controversy, and to needlessly insult. And one of the things that I do think folks on the right end of the spectrum, not at Yale, so I'm going to preface this by saying this is actually not a critique of Yale. This is a critique of folks on the right end of the spectrum. I don't even know if they're on the right end of the spectrum, more broadly outside of Yale. And so I'm thinking of really odious people, folks like Milo Yiannopoulos, who are often brought to college campuses, again, not Yale and not the Buckley program by any stretch of the imagination, but they come to college campuses at the behest and as the guest of right-of-center organizations. And the claim is that they are advancing the values of free expression. But they're not. What they're doing is they're using free expression for their own purposes, and then they're causing tension and controversy at the expense of people who want to actually engage in a real dialogue and a real debate and a real give and take. And so what happens is they rile campus, they stress the fabric of a community that is supposed to engage in a real discussion, and they do it under the name of free speech, when in fact they're hurting the very ideas or the very processes by which ideas are formed. That is the purpose of a robust statement of free expression. So that's not actually an answer to Lauren's question, but it is something that is an often forgotten part of the Woodward report that I think to many folks outside of Yale might be something that is valuable.
I mean, the Woodward report is in certain ways the conscience of what the university should be. And Nathaniel and I have had our differences over the historical section of the Woodward report, but I think we're in complete agreement on the general statements of principle. You know, something that tends to be overlooked is that what happens at a place like Yale is determined not so much by the student protest of the day, but by the composition of the faculty. And since you brought up Robert Dahl, I actually just recently read a story about Bob Dahl. He was on the Yale faculty at a time when a promising young student decided he was going to write his dissertation as a refutation of Dahl. Bob Dahl heard about this, and he volunteered himself as the student's advisor. And rather than arguing him or putting down what he was trying to say, he helped him sharpen his arguments against himself and promoted him, and the student went on to a fairly glorious career. And that essentially is how faculties stay intellectually alive and intellectually significant, is if they're willing to open themselves to the critique of new scholars and welcome in other perspectives, even if they're against their own. And one of the most troubling things about what has happened at elite universities over the last 2 generations is that an ideological group of scholars came in and they decided that was not the rules they were going to play by. They, in fact, were going to promote people who parroted their ideological views, and that they would essentially remove from the academic world those who disagreed with them. So you can actually argue that the Woodward report is not just about what happens in terms of demonstrations on campus and so forth. It's the ideal that ought to animate the faculty as well, and frequently is not anymore.
Yeah, I think I might add, and I think that's a great point, that the faculty does seem to be, with a few very notable exceptions, very I wouldn't say hostile, but nervous and just not super receptive to groups, I think, like the Buckley program. There's still a decent number of faculty who are very engaged with groups like us, and but there is a large chunk that as well doesn't really want to be associated. I am not saying in any way that we should have hiring quotas for ideologically professors who are on one side of the ideological spectrum or the other. That doesn't help us at all, right? That creates the idea that certain professors are tokens, that they've been hired for a specific purpose and not their own academic merits. It's a tough question. How do you change that bias against other ideas. And I don't have a solution. I'm going to be upfront about that. But quotas and trying to make hires, conservative professor hires, are not the way to go. Definitely not.
I have little to add on the Woodward report to what's been said. I think that very well said by both here. I would say I'd be disappointed to hear that the faculty has moved in that direction. And when I was here, I had wonderful faculty across the board. In fact, I believe I actually may have set the record for most credits taken in 4 years. That was rumored to me by the dean at the time. The professors I had wonderful, dear departed people like Cyrus Hamlin, Maria Menacol, Harold Bloom is still here. To my certain knowledge, have political views that on average and in general would disagree with those of most of the people in this room. And it never came up. I took classes on Goethe, and it wasn't the intersectionality of Faust Part 2. It was just, let's learn the German, let's enjoy the poetry. And I'd be disappointed to hear that that has failed. I think institutions like directed studies seem to still be vibrant as far as I can tell. I know Weaver was in it this past year. That was one of my formative intellectual experiences. And I do think that at the time, as long as one had the foresight to self-select one's courses, of course one could take crazy classes. The Blue Book was chock full of them in the early 2000s, as I take it is now. But if one had the foresight to choose professors adequately, I thought Yale still offered a wonderful education for which I am eternally grateful.
Wallace, you've had some experience you had some experience with the administration, and you were telling me a story.
Yeah. This is to put you in the context. When I was about Weaver's age, coming onto campus in fall of 1999, some of the older alums probably did not have a freshman orientation program quite as aggressive as the one that is currently in place. And the freshman orientation was general, how to sign up for classes, how to find friends, where to go for mental help if you have a breakdown of some kind, the normal stuff that any university would do. Yale also had, and I presume still had, a fairly undescribable in mixed company orientation to sexual concupiscence, shall we say, involving a variety of contraceptive methods and sort of very graphic presentations of the subject matter. I will leave it at that. You can use the rest for your imaginations. That is, so in the fall of 1999, everyone went to this. The magazine Light and Truth, which is a right-wing magazine on campus, largely staffed by members of the Conservative Party from the Yale Political Union, wrote a freshman orientation guide, and it suggested some professors to go to, some professors to maybe avoid, and it, among other things, said that one should feel free to skip the more aggressive, for those of a traditional mindset, you may skip this sexual orientation on sexual matters. The magazine, which was it's a very glossy, beautifully published magazine at no small expense, was distributed, to my knowledge, to all freshmen on campus. It was placed in little cubby holes in the entranceways on Old Campus, also to Timothy Dwight and Silliman College. And within hours of and this is all written up. I was not there at the time. I was just third day of school, right? So don't blame me. The magazine was confiscated by the freshman counselors. About 800 or 900 copies of the magazine were taken out of these cubby holes. In my own residential college, which was the center of sort of a national furor for a few weeks, they were actually not returned to the Light and Truth staff. They were simply junked and thrown into a dumpster. The argument being that there's a prior restraint at Yale about leafleting in these cubby holes, which are generally, sales of futons and, delivery flyers and things like that are in there. This was the unique document taken out and thrown away. My friend, who's still my best man in my wedding, he was the publisher of Light and Truth at the time, at the tender age of 20, and he was called before the dean of my residential college and told on the record, and you can read this in the volume 6, issue 2 of 1999, was told in no uncertain terms that in this particular residential college, the policy was to discourage members of the college from writing or participating in Light and Truth magazine, and quite ominously, don't forget that residential college deans write recommendations for grad school, which, to little meritocrats in the early 2000s, that is a terrifying statement to make. Ultimately, and it was water over the dam eventually. The magazine was re-leafleted at various points and eventually became a national thing, covered in the Times and the Washington Times, etc. And that was sort of the way things were. The coda to the story, alas, is that the Intercollegiate Studies Institute, which I'm sure many people are familiar with, gives out an annual award for the worst occasion of anti-conservative bias on campus. And Light and Truth came in second place to Dartmouth, because the Dartmouth Review was not only confiscated, but it was burned at Fahrenheit 451, and so they edged out Yale that year. But again, this was a contretemps for a few months, and then the thing they continue to publish to this day, it was a bad kerfuffle, but, does that de-justify the entire university? I don't know. But it was certainly, I would say, a violation of the principles of the Woodward Report. And I do think, in response to Nathaniel's point, I do think on this one, and I agree with the Milo Yiannopoulos comment, this was Light and Truth was written in that sort of edgy, college conservative, they're 18 to 22-year-old hormonal kids, they're trying out new ideas. It was edgy, but it was certainly not in the realm of something that I thought was inappropriate. And I agree that the right, generally outside of Yale, it's inappropriate to invite some of the people they've been doing, like Milo Yiannopoulos. I don't think there's a really good claim for that. I have also been denounced on Twitter by Milo Yiannopoulos before, personally, so I have a bias to declare that.
Just to be clear, I'm not arguing that any university should ever engage in censorship or any of the various different things that could be considered censorship. Placing onerous security fees on an event is a good example of something that often is done as a form of soft censorship. I'm not arguing that should ever occur to an individual like Mr. Yiannopoulos. I'm just arguing that I think we need to step back and say, look, he is not, he may be protected in what he can say, and we don't want anyone preventing anyone from speaking, so we're willing to adopt this absolutist stance. But when he does show up on a campus, he's actually harming the very values that free speech is a subsidiary value of.
And I have one more final question before we open up to audience questions. So in a February article for the Chronicle of Higher Education titled "How to Sway Higher Ed Skeptics," Yale President Peter Salovey noted that he was troubled by a study from the Pew Research Center finding that more than half, 56%, of Americans had very little confidence in colleges and universities. He wrote, quote, "In addition to these concerns over the value of higher education, social media provides 24-hour coverage of campuses, often focusing on select incidents that are not representative of the entire student body or, at times, of anything at all. As a result, much of the public has a distorted view of an undergraduate today." So my question is, regardless of whether you agree or disagree with that, what do you think can be done to reverse this erosion of public confidence in higher ed, if anything?
I'll dive in. Why not? Obviously the universities have long made a promising target for conservatives because people in them often say and do ridiculous things. Through the principle of synecdoche, you can say, these people doing these ridiculous things on the left are representative of the entire realm of liberal thought, which, may or may not be true. But, the question that occurs to me is whether a university actually is a good proposition from a consumer viewpoint. Obviously, if you look at what people make who go to universities, particularly elite universities, compared to people who do not, yes, obviously, that's an enormous value proposition. You make millions of dollars more over the course of your working lifetime than you would otherwise. But what exactly is the university teaching students that is of value to them? That's a question that is hard to answer, but the universities have avoided answering it, I think. Much as, there really isn't much discussion in the universities of what they are for in the first place, why they admit the students they do, why they teach what they teach. I've sounded this theme before, but conservatives often tend to have a somewhat caricatured view of how left-wing faculty actually operate. They have this idea of a professor wearing a Nehru jacket, brandishing Mao's little red book, and trying to indoctrinate undergraduates into the wonders of communism. It rarely works that way. Again, you find a few cartoon characters out there, but it's not usually what happens. What happens is, in the confines of the faculty lounge, the professors will say, you know, American political history, everything that needs to be said on that subject has been said. It's not really where the cutting edge is, and it's not what the students are interested in. They want to hear, like, but the really exciting news of race, class, and gender. This is intellectual history, foreign policy history. That should go. There's no need to teach that. Why take up valuable spaces? Same thing for pretty much everything else, like military history, business history. You know, one could go on and on. And I think the point is that actually those are the subjects that would appeal most to the students. The students actually aren't that interested in what the faculty have to offer. And if you actually were just looking at it from a standpoint of, you know, who applies to what are the courses that are actually in highest demand versus the ones that are actually in low demand, you would come to a somewhat different view of how the university ought to be organized. And the point, again, is that there are actually whole areas of intellectual endeavor that are simply not on offer at many of the elite universities because of these ideological predilections on the part of the faculty. And what is it that students actually get out of the experience? You know, in my experience, the thing that students most should get out of the university is to have some moment of real intellectual excitement around a subject that's really close to their hearts and that might even carry over into what they do afterwards. And at least talking to the students in recent generations whom I've known, there's less of that than there used to be. So Yale is in almost every way a better place than it was in my time, except on the education side. And there's a certain irony there, and it's something that ought to trouble the universities much more than it does.
Yeah, I'll attach myself to everything Jeff said. I mean, so I probably don't even need to speak. Two quick thoughts. One is one area I think the university, and this is just purely pedagogical, it has nothing at all to do with free expression. One area where the university is quite bad is in teaching writing. And I've seen a lot of people's writing. Even in the law school, saw a lot of undergraduate writing because I was doing work helping students apply to postgraduate fellowships. And consistently, I am just shocked at how bad folks' writing is. That probably begins at a secondary school level. So I think that that's actually a failure of secondary school education. And then the university does a really bad job of teaching writing because it's not really set up to teach writing. But that's just a modest thing that, you know, I'm surprised employers are willing to put up with. You know, in terms of, you know, what else is the university providing besides the core bits of education, and I agree with everything Jeff said. One of the things the university is providing is a kind of inculcation in values, and that happens at any university. And so I do think it's worth considering what type of values is Yale inculcating. And I think one of the values that Yale is not inculcating is how to be a tolerant member of a democratic community. And that occurs at those moments of peak unrest. I think in the everyday interactions, it's generally fine, but there are these moments of unrest where the public-facing values of the university are immediately to sort of assuage the protest, to give credence to the idea that some great harm occurred, and I think a little less of that would help in the long run. There's a lot of data actually that shows that college students have an unusually low, shockingly low support of, you know, sort of principles of free expression. There's a debate about whether that occurs before or after they come on campus, but I can't help but wonder whether once they've come on campus, at the very least it's being reinforced. So I think that public statements from people like Peter Salovey that are often kind of milquetoast could actually go a long way to changing how students leave the university in terms of what values they take with them, but also in terms of how the university is perceived in these moments of peak unrest.
Yeah, I agree with everything that's been said. One other thing I'd like to say, and I'm not sure how responsive this is to the question, but heck, it's a panel. I have a certain degree of charitable feeling and understanding toward the student radicals. I think it's a terrible abomination that some of these kids, and they are kids, have had their names splashed across publications across the country. And I think some of this bubbling up of a sort of Nietzschean ressentiment underneath these kids is largely an unintended byproduct of the meritocratic system, which is so much more of a sifting mechanism now than it was when I was admitted, certainly in the 80s, certainly in the 60s and the 70s and 50s. Many kids, just imagine, for instance, I'm somewhat familiar with Tokyo University and Beijing University. In Asia, typically, there's a general exam administered to everyone in the entire country, and the best scores, just rank ordered, get into the finest universities, and everybody is endowed with this sense of almost a Calvinist election to, they are certain of their merit. Yale really does operate very much in the same way, but there's a lot of, because we have a holistic way of admitting students, a lot of kids come here. If you're a 1600 SAT kid and you come from a high school in Cheyenne, Wyoming, one might enter Yale thinking, gee, was I admitted because I'm really brilliant, or was I admitted because Yale was light on the mountain states that year? That sort of thing, everyone here, they're 18 to 22, they're all certain of their election in that predestined sort of way. They come to Yale and the president says, you are the leaders of tomorrow. They don't say that at every private university. They say that here, they say it at Harvard, they say it at Princeton. So on one side, they're certain that they're the best and brightest. On the other side, Yale is not Lake Wobegon. There's a median, and some kids are on one side of the median, some kids on the other side of the median, and we're all on different ends of different medians. But there's a narcissism of small differences, and we're all, in light of the passing of the great Tom Wolfe, who is an expert on status seeking in American society, Yale, if it's anything else, is self-selected for people who, wherever they come from, are super status hungry, and they want to get ahead in life. And a guy one step ahead of them, and that gets under your skin. And so when you add to that an inflammatory environment of a slight, whether it be class-based, whether it be religious-based, whether it be racially based, certainly, I can see how that spills out in the 18 to 22-year-old mind in wanting to go yell at somebody, wanting to let it all out. And the fact that it's filmed and now it's available on the Facebook and on the New York Times is really a sad thing. And I wish we could pull back and let them just be dumb 22-year-olds again, like we all were whenever our class year was. So that's sort of a preachy moment, but I do have a sympathy and an understanding for what's motivating the riot era, let's say.
One quick thing is Yale is a little bit like Lake Wobegon. In the sense that, the grade inflation is incredible.
Oh, that's
and so, Ray Fair, who's an outstanding economist, wrote a report on grade inflation, and it had this damning statement, and I'm not going to get it quite right, but it was something to the effect that in most departments there are effectively 2 grades, A and A minus, and then in some departments there's effectively 1 grade.
Yeah, I got an A minus in Ray Fair's class.
Yeah, well, that was a real A minus because Ray Fair curves. So I do think that's actually, a problem, and as a student I never would have suggested this. I do think on the how can a university garner a little bit more respect? I do think a mandatory curve might actually not be a bad idea. And it requires students to also perform better. I think that there are a lot of students who are not performing in their coursework but are performing in other areas because that's a way to differentiate themselves. And I do think more time in coursework would not be a bad idea.
Again, you go ahead.
They should totally implement that curve in 3 years.
Yes, exactly. Well put. I think it's, again, one of the troubling aspects about current Yale is that an astonishingly high percentage of students seek out mental help.
Yeah.
With the Student Health Service. And I think it's great that they're seeking out help, don't get me wrong, but what is the pressure that they're under that drives them to that? Students, in many ways, don't seem entirely happy with this place they've worked so hard to get to. And I think it is because of the fear of what's coming in the future and this need to achieve status even within Yale, which is somewhat separate from the need to do well academically. And the thing that's curious here is, students learn from being exposed to other viewpoints, from having, in some ways, experts in the fields argue with each other and obviously differ, and having to think for themselves where they come down on these questions. Students also benefit from failure. This is something that, again, we don't so much talk about, but the things you probably remember most from your undergraduate years are not the things that you did well, the things where you didn't do well, and that stayed with you and chafed you on some level. And by taking away that experience, hoping to make students comfortable and safe, in some ways, the university does them a disservice.
We have time for some questions. Just raise your hand if you have a question, and we'll come around with the mic over there. Just wait for the mic.
Thanks for coming and addressing us. It's been really great to hear you. I'd love to hear your comments about how you think social media in particular has really changed the perspective of how willing people are to engage in deep dialogue. That just seems to me a completely different platform that doesn't encourage free speech at all, and yet it's one of these platforms that this generation and successive generations are embracing as a way to kind of stand out and become superstars in their own right. I'd just like to hear how you guys think about that in light of this whole free speech on campus issue.
I mean, as someone who's grown up in a world that I've never really seen the world without rampant social media, I think it's been largely hurt free speech and good discussion and good dialogue, and it only inflames and helps characters like Yiannopoulos and people like him. As someone who's I run the Buckley's Facebook, and I've worked on a number of campaigns, and you look at the comments that people like to put, these online trolls, and unfortunately they get a lot of hits, they get a lot of views. People love that type of stuff, and it only like Nathaniel said, hurts people like us who actually care about the state of free speech and care about good conservative arguments and bringing those arguments to campus. And I wish I'd been around in a time where that hadn't been the case. There's no two ways about it, I think.
I'm certainly I was at Yale when the Facebook was created at Harvard, and then it was extended to Yale before it was thrown open to the whole world at one point. I certainly didn't grow up with social media. I'm not bathed in it now. I can tell you one anecdote that does disturb me. This is a law school anecdote. At Harvard Law, where I went to law school, there is a blog or social media site that is anonymous posting. And it may not exist anymore, but this did exist within recent memory, where students could post to this site comments that had been made in class during the Socratic dialogue in a law school course. So if you were discussing a famous Supreme Court case and somebody said something like, I really think Wickard against Filburn is a disastrous position on the Commerce Clause or something, that student would be by name exposed to the greater Harvard community and to the world for something that he or she said in class under duress when a professor is grilling you over a case. To me, I certainly, people respond to incentives. That's something that generally conservatives agree. I would be very careful with what I would say at a law school course in a law school environment where that were the case. Particularly looking forward to law firms where you may be in a minority politically, or even for clerkships. Nobody wants to come out of a professional school with a reputation of being the firebrand guy who says the wrong thing about Miranda versus Arizona. And so that, if it has a chilling effect, I'd be curious from the younger alums as well, that stuff, that would chill me. I certainly have not the courage to do that sort of thing, and I certainly didn't when I was a student. That could be very concerning to me.
Yeah, I don't have any good sense on how to answer your question because it's a question that's so hotly debated. I mean, I think most of us in this room would say it's not good, right? I don't think anyone in this room would say social media, on balance, was a good thing for Western society. Maybe there are some who think it was. I don't have a Twitter. I got rid of it. I had it for about a month in 2013, and I realized that I said things on Twitter that I would never write in an opinion column and publish. And I think that generally is true of a lot of people, except for I don't think they get rid of their Twitter. And that's not to say that I was great. I think it's that I wrote a lot of things in columns that I wish I had slept on the night before, and then I realized Twitter was even worse. And I think that there are a lot of students who are putting things out there that also don't die, which is to Wallace's point. And I think that they'll maybe come to regret that. And I don't think that they've been primed to be taught that these things live forever, unfortunately. In terms of what it has tangibly done, one of the more interesting things it's done is it's allowed people to organize very, very quickly. And that also can be a bad thing. So in fact, the incident that Jeff was talking about occurred, he and I were both at that conference. I had chaired the panel that he was speaking on. And Greg Lukianoff made this comment maybe 20 minutes, maybe an hour later. You had 250 students outside. And that's because they were able to put it onto a Facebook site, and folks were able to show up and then leave. So one of the things it allows people to do is set the bar for protest really, really, really low. I think the bar for protest should be really, really, really high. There are things you should protest. I would protest Milo Yiannopoulos. I wouldn't say that I would censor him, but I would get out and say, I think this guy's a bigot, and I think that whoever invited him is a schmuck. But I would keep that bar for protest really, really, really high. What social media does, and this is not in relation to allowing people to speak, it just allows people to organize. And I actually want to make it harder for people to organize so that the bar for protest is higher.
It's an interesting question. And usually I think social media actually is on balance a positive thing because it actually allows you greater exposure to more viewpoints than you would have had otherwise. I mean, I remember back in the day, it's like I subscribed to a lot of newspapers and I got The Economist and so forth. It's like, I want more opinions than what I'm getting here. Where do I find them? And nowadays, they're very easy to find. And I get a lot of articles and links through people posting on Facebook or on Twitter and things like that. So in that sense, it's a positive thing. But exactly what you're saying, the inhibition level is less for what people can say. And if you're looking for an amusing yet sad book, it's John Ronson's book, So You've Been Publicly Shamed, which is about the way that you can get these sort of pig piles of people responding to, again, what are just thoughtless or spur-of-the-moment tweets or Facebook posts in ways that ruin their lives. And, certainly we have seen that in action here on the Yale campus with this Sleeping While Black issue just now. And in that sense, social media is one of the things that is an incendiary force in the public dialogue and tends towards reductionism. What is a meme, if not a reduction in thought? What is 140 characters when all is said and done, except a way of shrinking your thought? And then toward the inflammatory remarks, because that is what gets the hits, that's what gets the attention, that's what drives the views. So it's both good and bad. I realize that's a sort of mealy-mouthed statement, but I think we're still working through it. It's only been around for a relatively short time, and we don't know what's going to happen in the future.
Further questions? Right up here. Come with the mic.
Thank you. I think this is really great. I'd like to bring up the topic of the breakdown of the core American family and what effect that has on attitudes. I look at families maybe in the past, a mother and a father with discussions, sitting at the table, learning about some adult problems, how you solve problems, what's going on in the world. I know that you had Amy Wax here some time ago. I don't know that Yale would have accepted her. She's professor of law at the University of Pennsylvania. And she talks about the sexual revolution and what effect that's had on the family, which is a disaster. She has recently been barred from an introductory course that she gave at the law school, I guess at the University of Pennsylvania. I think that's just awful. And I'm just wondering what you think about what role that has had, and I don't have the slightest idea what to do about it, but I think it is one of the biggest problems we have in this country. Thank you.
Want me to jump in? Sure.
You're the historian, so.
Okay.
Yeah.
I mean, it is, again, a very interesting question. And it fits into something we've been discussing here earlier, which is the meritocracy. Again, Yale is diverse in almost every way except two. It is less diverse intellectually. It's less diverse politically in that sense we've talked about. It's also less diverse from a class perspective. And the direction is unmistakable. Yale has simply, in terms of people who come from the bottom 60% of the income distribution, have just gone down over time. Those who come from the top 10% has gone up over time. And what is it that distinguishes the upper 10%? I would commend to you the cover article in this June Atlantic by Matthew Stewart, which is on how the top 9.9% has become a new hereditary aristocracy. And you certainly see this in places like Yale, and in fact, the cover illustration is a baby in a Yale onesie. And again, what distinguishes people who are at Yale who come from this top 9.9%? They come from intact families. Sometimes those are non-traditional families, but they're intact families. And this, again, is part of what you see that Charles Murray wrote about. He's not allowed to talk about this on college campuses, but his book, Coming Apart, is how the pathologies, including single parenthood, that once were not confined, but more characteristic of inner-city black families, are now becoming characteristic of white working class and even middle class families. The upper class is doing fine in terms of the sanctity of the family. You see less divorces among people who are advantaged, people who graduated from places like Yale. You see much more divorce and single parenthood coming further down the scale, which is one of the reasons why, although Yale offers a free ride to people who make essentially less than $120,000 a year, it can't seem to find people who are otherwise qualified for Yale, and this is in part because of single parenthood and the pathologies that affect single parent families. This also played into the election because there was a considerable lack of sympathy on the part of the Democrats for the plight of the left behind. And the rage of the Trump voters had a lot to do with not just single parenthood, but the opioid epidemic, the fact that U.S. mortality is actually declining for the white population for 2 years in a row, which is something that has never happened in an industrial advanced society. And all of these things, in many ways, do stem from the decline of the family. Is it cause? Is it symptom? It's both. But it's something that society ought to worry a lot more than it does, but it gets caught up in these other cultural war issues as opposed to just what is best for Americans in terms of the way they live their lives and their outcomes. And this is what makes people feel that the American dream is disappearing.
Another question? We have a question right here. Just wait for the mic.
What would be good examples of free speech issues that have arisen at Yale that something has been learned? One of the most significant ones was the Silliman College one. And I wonder if looking back now on what happened there, what was learned from that? And if the same thing arose in the future, would it be handled differently by people who handle those things? And what other instances, maybe a very different one would be the Yale basketball captain. And it seems to me from free speech was an issue there. I'd just be interested in your views on what Yale has learned recently on free speech.
So this is hard because we don't have any administrators here. But I've often would speak to administrators, and I think two things come out. One is nobody planned in advance of 2015 for how to deal with incidents like that. There was no playbook. In past years, there often has been a playbook, and the Woodward Report in its third section gives a playbook. That's what Harry Wellington and Lloyd Cutler wrote in the Woodward Report, and it's a really good playbook for how to deal with speech issues. I know there are administrators in certain schools, so this is not Woodbridge Hall, but I know there are certain schools that do sort of like a tabletop exercise for how would we deal with these issues. And that's to preserve your values, because what happens is in a moment of crisis, you're gonna basically, if you're an administrator, try to make the crisis go away. Your first impulse is not, I'm gonna try and stand for my principles. Your first impulse is, I want to make sure this doesn't end up in the New York Times. And then once it's in the New York Times, I don't want it in the New York Times tomorrow. And that leads to some kinds of capitulation. What some schools have done, and schools, I mean organs within Yale, they've gamed out how do we respond to these type of events so we don't give in to our first impulse and we make the long-term strategic decision. That's great. And I commend all of the administrators who've done that. I don't know if that's happened in the Secretary's office, which is where it should happen. In terms of the basketball incident, that's actually linked to a more interesting problem, which is Title IX. So there the university may have acted because it felt it was mandated by Title IX and either federal guidelines or regulations. So I think that is a space that in the next coming years is going to be very contested. You see moves at the Department of Education. You also see moves at Yale to continue following the old guidelines, even though they are not mandated. And again, it's all guidelines, so from a legal perspective, it's very complicated. I think that space is going to be a space where there's going to be a lot of movement in the next couple of years. And I think that's going to have some implications for where Title IX has overstepped into free expression.
This discussion is altogether too agreeable in some ways. Yeah. We're agreeing with each other on everything. God, how much fun is that? And often in the past, you and I have disagreed over the historical record, particularly Kingman Brewster's record on free speech, and various incidences, whether they be the Wallace disinvitation or postponement, whether they be the William Shockley visit, whether they be any of these other things. What I think we would agree on is that the accusation that Kingman Brewster's Yale was weak on free speech issues stung his conscience.
Yes.
Which is what led to the Woodward Report, which in many ways did criticize Brewster, whether justly or unjustly. And I talked to Donald Kagan fairly recently, and he's like, what followed from the Woodward Report was really 20 years of free expression at Yale. And in that sense, the university did learn from these free speech episodes. Has it learned from the recent ones? I don't think so. I can't point to what positive has come out of the Silliman riot. In fact, I would only point to negative things, particularly the departure of the Christakises and the widespread perception that Yale failed to back them as it should have. And the Jack Montague case, I think, is actually going to blow up spectacularly on Yale. I know something about what's going on in the court proceedings. I don't think Yale is going to win. I think it's going to be a disaster from a public relations standpoint, from a moral standpoint, from all kinds of ways. And Yale will, I think in that sense, wish it had proceeded otherwise. Maybe that will actually cause the university to organize itself different and approach some of these issues differently.
Just to follow up, one of the things that did show, Jeff was right, that there was a perception even on campus that the university wasn't backing its faculty. It shows the lack of faculty governance, because if there was real faculty governance and you were a faculty member and you were worried that was going to be you next, I think you would have acted as a governor very differently, and you would have seen some change that never occurred. So I think that a root cause, and this is a thing that people often say is a root cause of a lot of problems, is their faculty have just given up any semblance of faculty governance because it's difficult, and they've given it over to professional administrators who don't think, what's my conscience? They think, how do I get it out of the New York Times? And they don't think, what's my conscience? Because they're not tenured faculty. They're hired administrators, and I'm not going to name any names, but I've got some folks in the Yale College Dean's office who I have in mind.
I think, there's a lot, someone said there's been a lot of agreeing on this panel, and I'm going to agree with something that's been said. Nathaniel, his point that there was no plan for what happened in long-term plan and response for what happened in Silliman College a few years ago. I think that's completely true, and like he said, I don't think I've seen anything, that's been taken, any measures that have been taken structurally and specifically to that incident. And I also very true that they failed to back the faculty. I think that's probably that, and the fact that the students were never really punished. A lot of people wanted the students to be punished. We can debate on the merits of that. But the fact that never happened is kind of what was like the red meat that the national media picked up and really inflamed the public about. And the fact that nothing still has been done is probably a sign that there is some poor governance going on, and that should probably change should something like that happen again, which it could very well. That could very well be the case, and it would just be, I think, an even greater PR disaster for the university if they don't take any measures, and if they don't have some sort of planned response that clearly puts forth some sort of backing of the faculty and some statement to the students that you have to treat your professors with respect. I think it was very funny that the students in the courtyard were saying, you need to make this place a home, and swearing at the professors. If I ever spoke to my parents like that in my home, I'd be, it would not be pleasant for me.
And the students in that episode were not only not disciplined, Some of the worst instigators were actually awarded Yale's award for furthering peace and racial harmony on campus, which is the opposite of the truth.
Yeah, that is exactly what happened, actually.
I thought, actually, I'd never heard Nathaniel's point before about the faculty governance issue. That's actually a very interesting point that I'd like to think about some more. It seems to me it parallels the argument often made about Congress under Article 1, that increasingly we have an imperial presidency, largely because Congress doesn't do anything and lets the administrative state handle it. I wonder if there's a parallel to the Yale faculty there. A congressman has no particular incentive to stand up and take a lot of flack for a new bill. An untenured faculty member has very strong incentives to stay silent. Behind closed doors, I don't know your experiences. I've talked to a number of my old professors about these things across the spectrum politically. They generally share what I would consider to be commonsensical responses within the 40-yard lines to all of these kerfuffles. I don't think the faculty, barring sort of the extreme tail event faculty, I think the general run of Yale faculty is not actually as nutty as we like to think of them, and that's a sign of hope.
Yeah, in terms of what's happened, you've seen a growth, and I don't have the exact numbers in front of me, but you've seen a growth of non-faculty administrators in places like the Yale College Dean's office. And there's just been a huge growth in those people. I don't actually think they're taking up jobs that were once done by faculty. I think they're taking up jobs that never used to exist. And so, and again, I'm not going to name particular individuals, but I have a lot in mind. They come often with PhDs in education. So they don't come from a tenured environment where they were really producing historical scholarship or other things. And they were trained to be university administrators. And those are the people who I think are exercising decision-making capacity in a lot of situations, and I think they often are making the wrong decisions.
We have time for one more question, if there is one. How about Rob over there?
Hello, I'm curious why you think students have so much power on college campuses. It still amazes me that they were able to get the Christakis removed from their posts. Why is the administration so willing to acquiesce to student demands rather than making demands of the students? For every extreme activist on Yale's campus, there are 100 bright kids who would gladly take their place. So why do the students here have so much power?
I'm doing a lot of talking. I'll apologize for that. But I don't think students have a lot of power. I think they can do discrete things sometimes. But no student's going to decide where a building is, which is a multi-million-dollar decision, hundreds of millions of dollars in some cases. No student's really going to change the trajectory of faculty hiring. I think that in a couple of incidents, students are able to leverage concern, again, often by administrators who are kind of weak-willed, to avoid public limelight. And so I think what they're doing is they're leveraging, in a lot of these cases, social media, the press, and other things to achieve very narrow results. Sometimes those results can have, in some cases, big price tags. So to ameliorate an incident, oftentimes an administrator will get money to be spent on a particular program. But I think for the large part, there's a tendency to overemphasize the degree to which students who are very transitory, they're there for at most as an undergrad 4 years, what they can really do. They can cause damage, I think, when they are able to use social media or other types of tools to create some pressure.
I partially disagree with that. I think students don't really have power per se, but the students that are vocal on these issues, the most vocal students end up largely agreeing with these administrators that we've talked about on a whole host of issues. So it's not that they have incredible power or sway over, the direction that the university is going to take in the long term. But when it comes to specific issues like this, the fact that, students in the Silliman Courtyard dislike the appropriation of Halloween costumes to a specific culture, and the fact that administrators in the Yale College Dean's office agree with them on that same topic is not going to make they're not going to have a tough time presenting their case to the university on why certain professors should be removed. It's not that they're convincing the great decision makers of the Yale bureaucracy that they're right and you've got to do this and acquiesce to our demands here. No, it's just that, like Nathaniel said, they come from they have these backgrounds. They have a PhD in education. They're largely very liberal because they've spent a lot of time in the academy, and they just have the same views as these vocal activists on campus, and they don't have a tough time getting them to do what they want. I'm speaking to a specific case here, but I think you can kind of extrapolate that to the larger picture of, what direction does the university take with regards to campus speech.
I wouldn't agree that the Christakises were removed by the students or by anybody. They did leave of their own volition, but they did partly because they felt unsupported by the administration, and Silliman became an unpleasant place, thanks partly to student actions, and case in point would be the students who refused to take their degrees from the hand of Master Christakis, which in many ways just runs counter to the whole Yale ethos, but they were never called out for that. I think the thing that concerns a lot of us, which is broader, is universities are among the very few institutions in society that at this point are the preserve of the left, and we don't like what we see coming out of them, which is to say that concepts that once upon a time were confined to the seminar room have become weaponized and are spreading throughout society. One didn't hear that much outside of the seminar room about the concept of the patriarchy or rape culture or white supremacy and so forth. And now those are kind of omnipresent. And it's very difficult to dissent from that line. For students, for faculty, for administrators, for everybody. Everyone wants to be popular. No one wants to be seen as a white supremacist or racist. That is progress of a kind, right? But no one wants to go against what is seen as the wave. And that is precisely the issue that's where free speech comes into play. If you can't actually make the unpopular points, then you don't have free speech.
I'm a lawyer, so I take a legal hammer and everything looks like a legal nail. I wonder to what extent the degree of litigation risk to a $20–30 billion institution is driving a lot of these decisions. We live in an era, and this stretches back to when I was in college, where suits against universities are particularly large suits against very major universities, seem to be on the rise. You're going back to Gratz versus Bollinger, the Fair versus Rumsfeld about military recruiting on campus. I think the Title IX suits, I don't know much about them, but that are pending against Yale. I wonder to the extent to which Yale as a risk mitigating institution is listening to, and I don't know who the general counsel of Yale is, but I wonder to what extent what we view as capitulation to aggressive demands may be a better way of protecting Yale's assets and resources against potential lawsuits. That's neither good nor bad. Maybe it's a feature of the American litigious system, but I do sense a little bit of caution and heavily lawyered caution in some of the statements I hear from Yale the last few years.
Well, I want to thank everyone for coming this morning, and please join me in thanking our panelists.